The great hall of Zentari Prime buzzed with voices from 100 different species as representatives from across the galaxy gathered for the emergency session of the Galactic Council. Ambassador Vexthul of the Korthic Empire stood at the central podium, his scaled hide gleaming under the artificial lights, while his 4 arms gestured dramatically as he spoke to the assembled crowd. The humans had become a problem, and Vexthul was not shy about expressing his displeasure to anyone who would listen. For the past 6 months, human ships had been appearing in what the Korthics considered their rightful territory along the Outer Rim. 3 research stations now orbited mineral-rich worlds that had been claimed by the Korthic Empire for over 2 centuries, even if they had never bothered to actually colonize them. Captain Jake Morrison had been leading these human expeditions aboard his exploration vessel. Destiny's Edge and his crews had been nothing but polite and professional in all their dealings with other species. They followed galactic law to the letter, filed all the proper paperwork with the Council, and even offered to share their research with any interested parties. This diplomatic approach only made the Korthics angrier the humans were making them. Lookbad and General Thraxmer did not appreciate being shown up by what he considered to be a weak species of mammals who had barely learned to travel between stars. The Korthics had built their empire through strength and intimidation, conquering 17 star systems in the past century alone. They did not negotiate or compromise. They simply took what they wanted, as Vexthul continued his lengthy complaint about human encroachment into Korthic space. Many of the other representatives began to grow restless. The Valdorians were busy with their own trade disputes. The crystalline Nexari cared little for organic conflicts, and most species found the whole situation rather boring. Humans were still newcomers to galactic society, and few believed they posed any real threat to an established empire like the Korthics. But Elder Zifron of the Altarian Collective had been listening carefully to every word. His ancient species had been observing the galaxy for over 10,000 years, and they had developed an almost supernatural ability to read the patterns of history. When civilizations rose and fell, when species thrived or went extinct, when wars began and ended, the Altarians usually saw it coming long before anyone else. The old being rose slowly from his position among the observers, his long robes rustling as he moved. The hall gradually fell silent as creatures turned to look at him. The Altarians rarely spoke at council sessions, and when they did, it was usually worth hearing Zephran's voice carried easily across the vast chamber despite his advanced age. He had been studying the humans ever since they first made contact with galactic civilization just 40 years ago. Unlike most species who judged others by their current military strength or technological advancement, Zephron had taken the time to examine human history through their own records. He found had deeply disturbed him. The humans had evolved on a world that most species would consider uninhabitable. Their planet was racked by natural disasters, populated by deadly predators, and subject to extreme weather that could kill an unprepared traveler in minutes. Most intelligent species evolved on garden worlds where cooperation and peaceful coexistence were the keys to survival. But Earth was different, and so were its children. Humans were persistent predators who had evolved to chase their prey across vast distances until their targets collapsed from exhaustion. They did not give up when faced with obstacles. They found ways around them or through them or over them. When their civilizations fell, they rebuilt them. When diseases wiped out millions, the survivors kept going. When wars devastated their continents, they eventually made peace and then prepared for the next conflict. Most troubling of all was their approach to justice and revenge. Humans had a concept they called holding grudges, and they were very good at it. When someone wronged them, they remembered. When someone hurt their people, they never forgot. Their history was filled with examples of conflicts that lasted for generations. with children carrying on the fights of their parents and grandparents. Schiff had studied their world wars where humans fought with a brutality that shocked even experienced galactic historians. He had read about their smaller conflicts, where outnumbered forces held positions until the last soldier fell. He had learned about their cultural traditions of honoring their dead and seeking justice for wrongs committed against their people. Elder knew that Captain Morrison and his crews represented something that the galaxy had not seen in a very long time, a species that would not back down when threatened and would not forget when attacked. Most civilizations learned to avoid unnecessary conflicts because the costs were too high and the benefits too small, but humans seemed to operate by different rules. They valued concepts like honor and loyalty over practical considerations like profit margins and casualty reports. They formed emotional bonds with their comrades that went beyond simple military cooperation. When one human died, the others took it personally in a way that most species found difficult to understand. Zefran tried to explain this to the assembled representatives, but his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The Korthiks in particular found his warnings amusing rather than concerning. General Thraxmer laughed openly when the elder suggested that attacking humans might result in consequences that would last for generations. The general had personally led the conquest of 7 different species, and none of them had posed any significant challenge to Korthic military might. His forces used overwhelming firepower and shock tactics to break enemy resistance quickly and decisively. Most species surrendered after losing a few major battles and facing the prospect of total annihilation. Why should humans be any different? The Korthic military had been studying human capabilities for months, and their assessment was not impressive. Humanity fielded a relatively small number of ships with weapons and defenses that were adequate but not exceptional. Their ground forces were well trained, but lacked the size and experience of the Korthic legions. Most importantly, they were scattered across hundreds of worlds with no centralized command structure that could coordinate an effective defense. General Thraxmer was confident that a quick strike against the 3 human research stations would send the message that the Korthiks were not to be trifled with. Other species would see what happened to those who challenged the Empire and would think twice before encroaching on Korthic territory. Debate continued for several more hours, but the outcome was never really in doubt. The Korthiks had already made up their minds before calling for the council session, and they were simply going through the motions of seeking approval for their planned action. Most of the other species either supported them or simply did not care enough to object. Elder Zefran made one final attempt to change their minds. He stood again and spoke directly to General Thraxmer, his ancient voice carrying a note of genuine sadness. The old being had seen too many civilizations destroy themselves through arrogance and miscalculation. He had watched species that should have known better make fatal mistakes because they underestimated their enemies or overestimated their own capabilities. The Korthiks were about to join that long list of fallen empires, but Thraxmer was not interested in the warnings of a pacifist species that had not fought a war in over 3,000 years. The Altarians were scholars and philosophers, not warriors. They did not understand the realities of power and conquest in the modern galaxy. Vote was called, and the result was overwhelming. The Korthic Empire was granted permission to take military action against human encroachment into their territorial claims. The 3 research stations would be given 24 hours to evacuate their personnel before being destroyed. General Thraxmer smiled as he received the formal authorization. His war fleets were already assembled and waiting for orders. The humans would learn what happened to those who challenged the Korthic Empire, and the lesson would not be forgotten by other species who might consider similar actions as the council. Session ended, and the representatives began to file out of the great hall. Elder Zefran remained in his seat, staring up at the star charts that decorated the ceiling. Somewhere out there, Captain Morrison and his crews were going about their daily routines, completely unaware that their lives were about to change forever. The ancient being closed his eyes and began to compose a message that he would send to every major government in the galaxy. Future historians would need to understand exactly how the Great War began and why so many species failed to see it. Coming, the humans were about to teach the galaxy a lesson about the dangers of waking a sleeping predator. The first explosion shattered the morning calm in New Denver base, just as Colonel Lisa Grant was reviewing the daily security reports over her coffee. The emergency klaxons began wailing immediately as the base's defense systems detected multiple incoming projectiles from orbit. Grant dropped her mug and sprinted toward the command center while her boots echoed through corridors that were suddenly filled with running personnel. Lieutenant Ben Carter was already at the communications console trying to raise the orbital defense platforms when Grant burst through the door. His face was pale as he turned to report that all 3 platforms had been destroyed in the opening salvo. The attacking ships had appeared without warning and launched their assault with devastating precision. Grant grabbed the tactical display controls and pulled up a view of the space around New Denver. 12 Korthik heavy cruisers hung in orbit, like black daggers against the star field, their weapon systems glowing with the heat of recent discharge. More ships were arriving every few minutes as the attack fleet continued to deploy. The colonel had been a career military officer for over 20 years, and she had never seen anything like the firepower that was being directed at her small research base. The Korthiks were not trying to capture the facility or negotiate a surrender. They were simply destroying everything they could target from orbit. The base's defensive systems were designed to handle pirates and raiders, not a full-scale military assault by an interstellar empire. The shield generators were already overloading under the constant bombardment, and emergency power was failing throughout the facility. Grant opened a channel to all personnel and began issuing evacuation orders while Carter worked frantically to establish communications with the other human bases. New Seattle was under attack as well, and New Phoenix had gone silent completely. The Korthiks were hitting all 3 research stations simultaneously. The first wave of Korthik landing craft began descending through the atmosphere 20 minutes after the initial bombardment started. Grant watched the tactical display as dozens of assault shuttles broke through the cloud cover and headed for the base perimeter. Her defenders numbered less than 200 personnel, and most of them were scientists and technicians rather than combat troops. Sergeant Jake Murphy led the perimeter defense teams as they took positions in the outer buildings and prepared to sell their lives as dearly as possible. Murphy had served in 3 different colonial conflicts, and he knew that the human garrison was vastly outnumbered and outgunned. But he also knew that every minute they held out was another minute for the civilian evacuees to reach the emergency shelters. The Korthik ground forces advanced with mechanical precision, using their superior numbers and equipment to overwhelm each defensive position in turn. Their soldiers were bred for warfare and stood nearly 8 feet tall with natural armor plating that could stop most small arms fire. They carried weapons that fired superheated plasma bolts capable of melting through reinforced concrete. Grant coordinated the defense from the command bunker while her communications officer tried desperately to get a message through to the human fleet. The Korthiks were jamming most frequencies, but Carter managed to find a narrow bandwidth that was still clear. The transmission that he sent would become one of the most famous messages in human military history. This is New Denver base to any human vessel. We are under attack by unknown alien forces. Multiple ships, advanced technology. Colony population is 4,000 including families. We have maybe 6 hours before total base collapse. Request immediate assistance, but do not expect we will be here when you arrive. We won't last long, but we're making them pay for every inch. The message was picked up by a commercial freighter 3 systems away and relayed through the human communications network. Within hours, it would reach Earth and the outer colonies, carrying news of the first hostile action against human civilians in galactic space at New Seattle Base. Captain Sam Rodriguez was leading a fighting withdrawal through the research complex, as Korthik assault troops poured through the breached outer walls. His security teams had managed to evacuate most of the civilian population to the underground shelters, but the enemy forces were advancing too. Quickly, for an organized defense, Rodriguez had been a special forces operator before accepting the posting to New Seattle, and he used every trick he had learned in 2 decades of military service. His teams turned the research facility into a maze of deadly traps and ambush positions, forcing the Korthiks to pay in blood for every corridor they cleared. The aliens had not expected such fierce resistance from what their intelligence reports described as a peaceful scientific outpost. Their assault plans called for a quick occupation with minimal casualties, but the humans were fighting like cornered animals. Every room had to be cleared at close range, and every advance cost them. Soldiers at New Phoenix Base, Major Kate Williams was facing an even more desperate situation. The Korthik attack had begun with a direct kinetic strike that collapsed the main administration building and killed nearly half of her security force in the opening minutes. The base's emergency systems were failing, and fires were spreading. Through the damaged sections, Williams organized the survivors into small teams and sent them to protect the evacuation routes, while she led a handful of volunteers in a suicidal assault on the Korthik landing zone. Her plan was simple and desperate. If they could destroy enough enemy shuttles, it might buy time for the civilian transports to escape the system. The Major and her team managed to destroy 3 Korthik landing craft with improvised explosives before enemy reinforcements overwhelmed their position. Williams died with a grenade in each hand, taking a dozen alien soldiers with her when she triggered the charges. The battle for New Denver lasted the longest as Colonel Grant's forces used the base's layout to maximum advantage. The research facility had been built into a series of underground complexes, connected by reinforced tunnels that the Korthiks found difficult to assault. Every junction became a killing ground, and every sealed door had to be blown open under fire. Grant knew that her position was hopeless, but she also knew that every hour of resistance was giving the evacuation ships more time to reach the outer system jump points. The base's automated systems were transmitting continuous data streams that would provide valuable intelligence about Korthik weapons and tactics to future human forces. Lieutenant Carter maintained communications until the very end, sending regular updates to any human ship that could receive them. His final transmission came just as Korthik assault troops breached the command bunker. This is New Denver Base. Final transmission. Base has fallen. Enemy in the command center. Civilian evacuation complete. Repeat, all civilian personnel have reached the evacuation ships. Tell Earth we held them for 6 hours and 37 minutes. Tell them we made the bastards bleed. The transmission cut off as plasma fire filled the bunker. General Thraxmer reviewed the casualty reports from his flagship with growing frustration. The 3 human bases had been destroyed and their military forces eliminated, but the cost had been much higher than anticipated. His ground commanders were reporting over 800 Korthik casualties from what should have been a simple occupation mission. The humans had fought with a ferocity that his intelligence officers had not predicted. Instead of surrendering when faced with overwhelming odds, they had chosen to die in place while ensuring that their civilian populations escaped. Such behavior was tactically illogical, but strategically effective, since it meant that thousands of human witnesses would carry news of the attack back to Earth. More troubling were the detailed sensor readings that his technical staff had compiled. During the battles, the humans had used primitive weapons and improvised tactics, but they had adapted quickly to Korthik fighting methods. Their defensive positions had been well chosen, and their soldiers had displayed excellent unit cohesion. Even under extreme pressure, But the general was satisfied that his primary objective had been achieved. The human research bases were gone, and their military presence in Korthik space had been eliminated. He authorized a broad-spectrum transmission that would carry his ultimatum to every human world in the sector. Your colonies in Korthik territory have been destroyed as a warning. Remove all human ships and personnel from our space within 30 days or face the same fate. The Korthik Empire does not negotiate with lesser species. The message was broadcast on all frequencies and repeated every hour for the next week. Thraxmer was confident that the humans would see reason and withdraw from the disputed systems rather than risk further confrontation with superior Korthik forces. What the general did not realize was that the evacuation ships from the 3 bases were already carrying more than just refugees. They carried the names and personal effects of every human who had died in the attacks. They carried detailed recordings of Korthik military communications that had been intercepted during the battles. Most importantly, they carried survivors who had looked into the eyes of their friends and colleagues as they died defending their homes. Captain Morrison's exploration ship arrived at the new Denver system 18 hours after the last transmission from Colonel Grant's command bunker. 6 months had passed since the destruction of the 3 human research bases, and General Thraxmer was beginning to believe that his strategy had worked perfectly. Korthik intelligence reports showed no human military activity in the contested region and no attempts to re-establish the destroyed outposts. The mammals appeared to have learned their lesson about challenging the Empire. The general spent his time planning new campaigns against other species that had been showing signs of independence. The crystal miners of Vega 7 had been late with their tribute payments, and the agricultural worlds of the Perseus Arm were beginning to question Korthik trade policies. Both situations would require military intervention to remind the subject species of their proper place in the galactic order. Thraxmer did not realize was that Admiral John Hayes had spent those same 6 months carefully orchestrating the largest military buildup in human history. Hayes had been the architect of humanity's expansion into space, and he understood better than anyone how to coordinate the resources of hundreds of worlds toward a single objective. The Admiral had learned about warfare from studying the great military leaders of human history. He had read about Alexander the Great and Napoleon Bonaparte, about Sun Tzu and Erwin Rommel, about every commander who had ever faced impossible odds and found a way to victory. But most importantly, he had learned about the American industrial mobilization during the Second World War. Hayes knew that humans had one advantage over most alien species. They could transform their entire civilization into a war machine when the situation demanded it. Every human colony had contributed ships and resources to what they were calling Operation Righteous Fury. Every corporation had retooled their factories to produce military equipment. Every family had sent their sons and daughters to serve in the rapidly expanding fleet. The response had been overwhelming and immediate. When news of the attacks reached Earth, the global government had declared a state of emergency and authorized unlimited military spending. Colonial assemblies had voted to suspend civilian shipping in favor of military logistics. Even the outer frontier worlds had emptied their treasuries to fund the war effort. Captain Steve Thompson had been leading the reconnaissance phase of the operation for 4 months, using modified civilian ships to map every Korthik installation across their 17 conquered systems. His teams had identified military bases, supply depots, communication networks, and industrial facilities. More importantly, they had located the prison camps where captured enemy species were held as slave laborers. Thompson was a former intelligence officer who had volunteered for the dangerous mission of penetrating Korthik space without being detected. His ships used advanced stealth technology and moved through remote star systems to avoid enemy patrols. The data they collected would be essential for the coming offensive. Dr. Amy Foster headed the intelligence division that was analyzing everything the reconnaissance teams brought back. Foster had been a xenobiologist before the war, but her expertise in alien psychology made her invaluable for understanding Korthic culture and military doctrine. She worked 18-hour days studying enemy communications intercepts and prisoner interviews. The doctor had discovered several important weaknesses in the Korthic command structure. Their society was rigidly hierarchical, with all major decisions flowing through a small group of senior officers. If the human fleet could eliminate the top leadership quickly, the remaining forces would struggle to coordinate an effective defense commander. Rick Davis was training the Marine assault teams that would be needed for ground operations on occupied worlds. Davis had been a Special Forces instructor before accepting command of the 1st Human Marine Division, and he was adapting traditional tactics for fighting in alien environments. Commander's Marines were learning to operate in different gravity conditions and atmospheric compositions while using equipment designed specifically for combat against Korthic soldiers. They studied alien anatomy to identify vulnerable points in Korthic natural armor and practiced urban warfare techniques for fighting in captured cities. The human fleet was assembling in the shadow of Jupiter's moons where the massive shipyards had been working around the clock to complete the final preparations. 847 ships had been gathered from every corner of human space, ranging from massive dreadnoughts that had been pulled out of mothballs to nimble fighters that had rolled off the production lines just days earlier, but the ships were only part of the story. Hayes had convinced the colonial governments to commit their entire industrial capacity to supporting the war effort. Ammunition factories were running at maximum output. Food processing plants were producing military rations, and medical facilities were training combat surgeons. More importantly, the Admiral had secured agreements from every major human corporation to redirect their civilian operations toward military support. Mining companies were extracting raw materials for weapons production. Shipping lines were carrying supplies to the fleet assembly points, and research institutions were developing new technologies for the coming campaign. The human response went far beyond simple military preparation. Churches and community organizations were organizing support networks for military families. Schools were teaching children about the importance of the war effort. Entertainment companies were producing propaganda films to maintain civilian morale. Hayes understood that this was not just a military conflict, but a test of human civilization itself. The Korthics had made the mistake of attacking human civilians, and now they would face the full fury of an aroused democracy. Every human being had a personal stake in seeing justice done for the victims of New Denver, New Seattle, and New Phoenix Elder. Zeph Ron had been monitoring human communications through his species' advanced sensor networks, and what he saw terrified him. The Altarian Collective had observed many wars over the millennia, but nothing quite like the mobilization that was taking place across human space. The ancient being composed another warning message to the Korthic Empire, but he knew it would be ignored, just like all the others. General Thraxmer was too arrogant to believe that his forces could be threatened by what he considered to be a primitive species of mammal. Chef Ron had studied the complete records of human military history, and he understood what was coming. The humans were not simply preparing for a battle, or even a campaign. They were organizing for total war against an enemy that had attacked their people. The comparison that kept coming to his mind was the human response to the attack on Pearl Harbor in their Second World War. The elderly Altarian remembered reading about how the Americans had transformed their entire society into a war machine within a matter of months. Civilian factories had been converted to military production. Millions of young people had volunteered for military service, and the entire population had united behind the goal of defeating their enemies. That same pattern was now being repeated on a galactic scale as hundreds of human worlds coordinated their efforts toward a single objective. The Korthics had awakened something that they did not understand and could not. Control Admiral Hayes stood in the observation deck of his flagship and watched the final preparations taking place around Jupiter. Supply ships were delivering the last loads of ammunition and provisions, while maintenance crews completed final inspections of weapon systems and engines. In less than 72 hours, the largest human fleet in history would begin its journey toward Corthic space. Admiral had received final confirmation that all reconnaissance teams were in position and ready to provide targeting data for the opening strikes. Captain Thompson's stealth ships were hidden throughout the 17 Corthic systems, waiting for the signal to begin painting targets for the incoming human forces. Hayes had spent months planning every detail of the operation, and he was confident that surprise would be complete. The Corthics believed that humans were too weak and too scattered to pose a serious threat. They were about to learn how wrong they had been. The communication console chimed with an incoming message from the Reconnaissance Division. Dr. Foster peered on the main screen with news that changed everything. Her teams had been analyzing the most recent intelligence reports, and they had discovered something that made the coming war personal for every human being. The Corthics had not simply destroyed the 3 research bases as a warning. They had taken prisoners. Foster's voice was steady, but her hands were shaking as she delivered her report. Sensor readings from the Corthac prison world of Gazar showed human life signs among the other captured species. Some of the people from New Denver, New Seattle, and New Phoenix were still alive and being held as slave laborers. The discovery changed the entire nature of the operation. This was no longer just about punishment or deterrence. It was about rescue and liberation. Every human who had thought their friends and colleagues were dead now had hope that some might still be saved. Admiral Hayes looked out at his assembled fleet and felt a cold rage building in his chest. The Corthics had made their final mistake when they decided to take human prisoners. Now there could be no negotiation, no compromise, and no mercy. The Admiral opened a fleet-wide channel and spoke to every ship captain under his command. The human offensive began at exactly 0600 hours, Galactic Standard Time, across all 17 Corthic systems simultaneously. Admiral Hayes had coordinated the timing so that every target would be hit before the enemy could mount an organized response or send warnings to other installations. And like the brutal but straightforward assault that had destroyed the human research bases, the opening phase of Operation Righteous Fury was surgical in its precision. Human forces did not target population centers or civilian infrastructure. Instead, they systematically began dismantling the military and industrial capacity that allowed the Corthic Empire to function. Captain Morrison commanded the destroyer Retribution as it led the assault on the Corthic naval base at Sigma Draconis. His ship had been specifically modified with enhanced weapon systems and improved armor to serve as the flagship for the 6th Attack Squadron. Morrison had requested this assignment personally because he wanted to be at the forefront of the campaign. The Retribution emerged from hyperspace, just outside the detection range of the enemy sensor grid, and immediately began coordinating with the stealth reconnaissance ships that had been watching the system for months. Captain Thompson's intelligence teams provided real-time targeting data. Morrison's squadron moved into attack position. Corthac Base was a massive orbital station that served as the primary shipyard for the northeastern sector of their empire. Dozens of warships were under construction in the external docking bays, while the internal facilities housed the administrative headquarters for 3 different Corthic Fleet Commands. Morrison studied the tactical display as his weapons officer painted targets on the enemy installation. The plan called for simultaneous strikes on the command center, the shipyard control systems, the ammunition storage areas, and the docking facilities. The goal was not simply to destroy the base, but to ensure that it could never be rebuilt. Human attack began with a barrage of long-range missiles that overwhelmed the Corthic point defense systems before the enemy could react. The warheads were specifically designed to penetrate armored installations and detonate inside critical systems. Within minutes, the orbital station was crippled and burning, but Morrison was not finished. His orders from Admiral Hayes were explicit. No Korthic military vessel was to escape destruction. The captain led his squadron in pursuit of the enemy ships that were attempting to flee the system while emergency. Repair crews tried desperately to restore power to the burning station. Human forces had studied Korthic ship designs for months, and they knew exactly where to target their attacks for maximum effectiveness. Enemy vessels that had been designed to intimidate primitive species found themselves outgunned by weapons that had been built specifically to kill them. Similar scenes were playing out across the Korthic Empire as human task forces struck at shipyards, supply depots, communication relays, and military headquarters. The attacks were coordinated with mathematical precision, and each target had been chosen to maximize the disruption to enemy operations. General Thraxmer was awakened in his command bunker on Korthic Prime by emergency alarms that had not sounded in over 50 years. His communications officers were struggling to establish contact with their outlying bases, while reports of human attacks flooded in. From across the Empire, the general had been expecting some form of retaliation from the humans, but nothing on this scale. Initial casualty reports suggested that his forces were losing dozens of ships and installations simultaneously. More troubling was the fact that the humans seemed to know exactly where to strike, for maximum effort. Thraxmer demanded an immediate assessment from his intelligence staff, but the reports only confirmed his worst fears. The human fleet was larger and better equipped than any of his analysts had predicted. Their tactics were sophisticated, and their targeting was precise. Most disturbing of all, they appeared to have detailed knowledge of Korthic military dispositions. Throughout the Empire, the general authorized the deployment of his reserve fleets while attempting to establish communications with the Galactic Council. If the humans were determined to fight a full-scale war, he would need to mobilize every available resource to meet the threat. But Hayes had anticipated this response, and his forces were already moving to intercept the Korthic reinforcements before they could reach their intended destinations. Human interceptor squadrons had been positioned along the major hyperspace routes, and they struck at enemy task forces while they were still in transit. Commander Davis led the Marine assault on the Korthic supply base at Wolf 359, which served as a major logistics hub for military operations in the outer systems. His forces had been training for this specific mission for months, and they executed their attack with devastating efficiency. Marines used captured Korthic shuttles to penetrate the base's defenses before launching their assault on the command center and storage facilities. Davis had studied the enemy's psychological profile, and he knew that Korthic soldiers were trained to follow orders without question. If he could eliminate their officers quickly, the remaining forces would be unable to mount an effective defense. Commander's tactics proved correct as the enemy garrison collapsed within hours of losing their senior leadership. More importantly, the humans captured intact computer systems that contained detailed records of Korthic military operations across 3 different sectors. Dr. Foster and her intelligence teams worked around the clock to analyze the captured data. While the offensive continued, what they discovered changed the entire strategic picture of the war. The Korthics had been systematically enslaving conquered species and using them as forced labor in their industrial facilities. Doctor found evidence of war crimes that went back decades, including the deliberate targeting of civilian populations and the use of captured soldiers for medical experiments. Most importantly, she confirmed the locations of 17 different prison camps where human survivors from the research bases might be held. Admiral Hayes received Foster's report while his flagship was coordinating the assault on the Korthic industrial complex at Vega Prime. The Admiral had been prepared to wage a war of punishment against the Empire that had attacked human civilians, but the evidence of systematic atrocities changed his objectives completely. Hayes opened a secure channel to Earth and requested authorization for an expanded mission. The human government responded within hours with unanimous approval for what they termed a liberation campaign. The war would continue until every prisoner was freed and every war criminal was brought to justice. The Korthik Empire began to collapse. As human forces methodically destroyed the infrastructure that held their conquered territories together, species that had been enslaved for generations began declaring independence as Korthik garrisons were eliminated or abandoned their posts. Captain Linda Park had been appointed as humanity's new ambassador to the Galactic Council, and she presented the evidence of Korthik war crimes to the assembled representatives. The documentation was so extensive and so damning that even species that had previously supported the Empire began calling for intervention. Park's presentation included detailed records of the attack on the human research bases, along with evidence of similar atrocities committed against dozens of other species. The ambassador demanded that the Council recognize humanity's right to seek justice for these crimes, and she warned that any interference would be considered an act of war. The vote was overwhelming in favor of non-intervention. Most species had no desire to face the same fate as the Korthiks, and they quietly began withdrawing their diplomatic support from the crumbling Empire. General Thraxmer found himself fighting a war on multiple fronts as his subject species rebelled, and his military forces disintegrated under constant human attack. His attempts to negotiate a ceasefire were ignored by Admiral Hayes, who had been authorized to accept nothing less than unconditional surrender. The general made one final desperate gambit by ordering his remaining forces to target human civilian colonies in an attempt to force a peace negotiation. The attacks were carried out by Korthik raiders who struck at remote settlements that had minimal defenses. Raids achieved their tactical objectives, but they proved to be the worst strategic mistake in Korthik history. The attacks on human civilians convinced even the most moderate voices in the human government that there could be no compromise with the Korthik Empire. Hayes received new orders from Earth that expanded his mandate even further. Operation Righteous Fury would continue until the Korthik Empire ceased to exist as a military power, and every war criminal was either captured or killed. Admiral looked at the tactical display showing the remaining Korthik systems and began planning the final phase of the campaign. 14 of the original 17 systems had been liberated, and their Korthik garrisons had been eliminated or captured. Only 3 worlds remained under enemy control, including Korthik Prime itself. But Hayes knew that the real work was just beginning. Somewhere in those remaining systems were the prison camps where human survivors might still be held. Captain Narration and his task force were already moving toward the Gazar system, where Dr. Foster believed the largest concentration of prisoners was located. Captain Janet Murphy led the rescue task force that dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Gaza system just as the prison world's twin suns were rising over the main detention complex. Her ships had been specially equipped with medical facilities and personnel transport capacity to handle the evacuation of potentially thousands of prisoners from multiple species. Murphy had volunteered for this mission because her brother had been stationed at New Seattle Base when the Korthiks attacked. Lieutenant Danny Murphy had been listed as killed in action, but recent intelligence suggested that some personnel had been taken prisoner before the base was completely destroyed. Captain studied the tactical display as her ships moved toward the planet while maintaining communication silence. Dr. Foster's intelligence teams had identified 17 different prison camps scattered across the hostile world's surface, but the largest facility was located near the equator, where the climate was barely tolerable for most species. Rescue operation began with precision orbital strikes that eliminated the prison camp's defensive systems and communication arrays. Murphy wanted to ensure that the Korthik guards could not call for reinforcements or threaten their prisoners during the liberation process. Commander Davis led the first wave of Marines. As they descended toward the main detention complex, and heavily armored assault shuttles. His forces had been briefed on the layout of the facility, and they knew exactly where to find the prisoner barracks and administrative areas. Marine assault was swift and overwhelming as Davis's team systematically cleared each section of the complex while searching for human survivors. The Korthik guards put up minimal resistance because most of their weapons had been destroyed in the orbital bombardment. What the Marines found inside the prison barracks shocked even veterans who had seen combat across multiple star systems. Thousands of beings from dozens of different species were packed into facilities that had been designed for a fraction of that number. The conditions were worse than anything described in the intelligence reports, but among the aliens were faces that the Marines recognized from personnel files and family photographs. Colonel Lisa Grant was found in the maximum security section, where she had been held since her capture at New Denver Base 8 months earlier. The colonel was thin and scarred, but her eyes still burned with the same determination that had made her a legend among human military personnel. Grant had spent her time in captivity, organizing the other prisoners and planning escape attempts that kept the Korthik guards constantly on edge. She had never stopped believing that human forces would eventually come for them, and she had kept detailed records of every guard rotation and security. Procedure Lieutenant Ben Carter was discovered in the communications section where the Korthiks had been forcing him to decode intercepted human transmissions. Carter had been feeding false information to his captors, while secretly documenting their intelligence, gathering methods for future use by human forces. Rescue teams found 47 human survivors in the Gaza complex, along with over 3,000 prisoners from other species. Many were too weak to walk, but all of them cheered when they saw the human Marines entering their cells. Captain Murphy personally oversaw the evacuation process as medical teams worked to stabilize the rescued prisoners for transport to the fleet hospital ships. The stories that emerged from the survivors painted a picture of systematic brutality that went far beyond simple imprisonment. Korthiks had been using their prisoners as test subjects for biological weapons while forcing them to work in dangerous mining operations that frequently resulted in death or permanent injury. Worse still were the reports of recreational torture conducted by guards who viewed their captives as less than animals. Murphy transmitted her findings directly to Admiral Hayes, along with a request for immediate authorization to expand the rescue operation to the other prison worlds. The Admiral's response came back within minutes, along with additional ships and personnel to support the liberation. Campaign General Thraxmer received news of the prison camp raids while he was coordinating the defense of Korthik Prime from his underground command bunker. The loss of the forced labor camps was a serious blow to the Empire's industrial capacity, but more troubling was the intelligence that the humans would now possess. General knew that the rescued prisoners would provide detailed information about Korthik military operations and security procedures. More importantly, they would serve as witnesses to war crimes that could be used to justify even harsher human retaliation in desperation. Thraxmer authorized attacks on human civilian colonies in the hope of forcing Admiral Hayes to negotiate a ceasefire. The raids were carried out by the last operational units of the Korthik fleet as they struck at remote settlements on the frontier. Worlds the attacks achieved their immediate tactical goals, as several human colonies suffered heavy casualties from orbital bombardment and ground assaults. But the strategic consequences were exactly the opposite of what the general had intended. News of the civilian attacks reached Earth just as the government was considering peace proposals that had been submitted through neutral intermediaries. The raids on defenseless settlements convinced even the most moderate politicians that the Korthik Empire could never be trusted to honor any agreement. Admiral Hayes received new orders that removed all restrictions on his military operations. The human fleet was authorized to use any means necessary to destroy the remaining Korthak forces and eliminate their capacity to threaten other species in the future. Final phase of Operation Righteous Fury began with the systematic destruction of every Korthic military installation in the remaining 3 star systems. Human task forces struck at shipyards, training facilities, weapons factories, and command centers with ruthless efficiency. Captain Morrison led the assault on the Korthok Naval Academy at Proxima Centauri, where the Empire's future officers were trained in the arts of conquest and intimidation. His forces captured the facility intact, along with thousands of young Korthics who had been indoctrinated from childhood to view other species as inferior. The captured cadets provided intelligence about Korthic military doctrine and strategic planning that helped human forces anticipate enemy defensive measures. More importantly, they served as examples of how an entire civilization could be corrupted by militaristic ideology. Final confrontation took place in orbit around Korthok Prime as Admiral Hayes led the main human fleet against the Empire's last major defensive installation. General Thraxmore commanded the defense from his flagship, while the planet's orbital fortresses provided covering fire for the remaining Korthak warships. The Battle of Korthik Prime lasted exactly 72 hours, the same amount of time that had been required for the Korthiks to destroy the 3 human research bases that had started the war. Hayes had planned this timing deliberately as a symbolic gesture that would not be lost on galactic historians. Human fleet used tactics that had been refined through months of combat against Korthik forces. Every enemy weakness had been catalogued and exploited, while new weapon systems had been deployed specifically for this final engagement. Thraxum found his forces outmaneuvered and outgunned by opponents who had learned from every previous battle. The humans had transformed themselves from peaceful explorers into efficient killers through sheer determination and superior organization. As his flagship took critical damage from human weapons fire, the general opened a direct communication channel to Admiral Hayes and requested terms for surrender. Thraxmore still believed that he could negotiate some form of settlement that would preserve what remained of his empire. Hayes accepted the communication, but his response became legendary. Throughout galactic civilization, the Admiral looked directly into the camera as he delivered humanity's final judgment on the Korthik Empire. You attacked our people. You thought we would forget, forgive, or give up. You are wrong on all counts. There are no terms. There is only justice. The Battle of Korthik Prime ended with the complete destruction of the enemy fleet and the surrender of the planetary government. General Thraxmore was captured alive and transported to Earth, where he would stand trial for war crimes along with hundreds of other Korthik officials. But Admiral Hayes understood that military victory was only the beginning of humanity's responsibility. The liberated species would need assistance in rebuilding their civilizations, while the Korthik population would require re-education to function in a peaceful galactic community. Captain Morrison was promoted to Admiral and given command of the Human Memorial Guard, a permanent fleet tasked with ensuring that the victims of the war would never be forgotten. The names of every person who died in the attacks on New Denver, New Seattle, and New Phoenix were engraved on the memorial ship Never Forget. Memorial vessel began a continuous patrol of the former Korthak space as a reminder to any species that might consider following their example. The ship's crew rotated every 2 years, but the mission remained constant: remembrance and vigilance. Elder Zephron addressed a special session of the Galactic Council 6 months after the war ended. The ancient being spoke to representatives from over 200 species as he delivered what would become known as the Human Warning.